Hello everyone, Travis Hatton here, Music Director of the Beaverton Symphony Orchestra. And I'm making this video for you today because this is going to be the last pre-concert talk for this very strange 2020-2021 concert season. And you know it's been very strange. Our concerts really have been very strange this year. The concerts that we have been able to do this year have been relegated to string orchestra concerts, relatively small in number, masked, socially distanced, and live streamed. Now, some of those things that I just told you about are also true for this concert as well. For example, we will be socially distanced, we will be masked, we will be live streamed. But this time, really exciting new wrinkle, where we're going to be able to include woodwind and brass players in this concert. And that is a really big change. Partly because, at least from my standpoint, if you can imagine that as a conductor, it is my job to put together the programs with various types of music, all right? And if you are just relegated to choosing music only for a 25-member string orchestra, then the possibilities that you have for variety, it's really narrow. And that's what we've been stuck with for quite some time. So even though this particular concert is going to be live streamed, it's going to be also with masks and social distancing, the simple addition of 8 wind and brass players, and that's all we're talking about. Not even the whole wind and brass section of the orchestra, but just 8 wind and brass players. Yeah, that makes just the repertoire choices just all that much more interesting and so much wider than they would otherwise be. Now, we are still going to be on the slightly small side. We're not going to get back with the full orchestra until the fall. But still, this concert has about 35 musicians in it. And you may know that the Beaverton Symphony has a little over 70 members. So we're still only using about half of the orchestra. But it's still very exciting. Still very exciting to be working with some winds and brass players and to actually sort of rehearse and practice music that we wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. So let me tell you what's on this concert. Now, full disclosure, even though we do have the possibility of having a few wind and brass players, the first piece that we're going to do is still a string orchestra piece. I chose it simply because it seemed to fit very well with the other pieces that we had on the program. And we're going to do a piece. I'll tell you about this piece now, right now. This is the piece by arguably the greatest English composer for string orchestra music, or certainly the most prolific. And his name is Gustav Holst. Gustav Holst was born in the 19th century, but lived all the way up until the 1930s into the 20th century. So he was one of those figures that sort of spanned the century change at that time. And if you think about the world at that time as well, he was born in the 1860s, lived into the 1930s. That is not only did music change a whole lot during that time, but the world completely changed during that time as well. So he had a lot to do and a lot to adjust to during the course of his career as a musician, and he did adjust. This piece that we're going to be doing for you, it's called the Moorside Suite. The Moorside Suite. As you may know, Gustav Holst was not only a prolific composer, but he spent a lot of his career as a teacher, as so many composers do, even today. For many years, he held a post at a school called the St. Paul School for Girls. Now, apparently, this school had a really nice string orchestra program, and Gustav Holst would actually write music for his students to play. And some of these things that he wrote, in fact, several of the things that he wrote for this school, are still in the modern repertoire today. It must have been really, I think, an amazing thing for those students to have Holst as their teacher and writing these really wonderful pieces for them and only them to play. This Moorside Suite, this started out as a brass ensemble piece that he then rewrote a bit for string orchestra with the idea of having his students at the St. Paul School play. didn't work out for him. In the end, he decided that this piece, this Moorside suite, was a little bit too difficult for the students to pull off. And I can tell you for sure, there is a fair amount of difficulty in this piece. So what he did is he put it aside, and then he wrote another piece called the Brook Green Suite, which is a little bit simpler, to be sure, but also a wonderful piece, and is also in the modern repertoire of string orchestra pieces. So the Moorside Suite, it is in fact what you might think from the title. Of course, there is an area in England where there are the moors. You know, the moor area is a kind of a bleak, sort of a boggy kind of area in England. However, it has a very, very rich musical heritage. There's a lot of folk music that seems to sort of organically grow out of this area. And so Gustav Holst took advantage of that to write this piece. So there's actually quite a lot of folk tunes incorporated into this piece of music. Now the piece of music itself is really, it's broken up into 3 movements. And the movements themselves are very different. Very, very different. They don't follow the kind of order that you might think of some kind of 3-movement piece of music. For example, the first one is a scherzo, the kind of piece that you would figure would be stuck in the middle of a multi-movement piece. But no, he starts this with a scherzo, and from a scherzo standpoint, it's very much a normal scherzo in terms of its form and its spirit. Now, here's the movement I want to talk to you about. Is my favorite movement in this piece. It's a brilliant, brilliant piece. The second movement is called the Nocturne. And gosh, it's so beautiful in a sort of haunting kind of way. It really takes sort of ancient church modes and uses that as the basis, as a lot of folk music is reflective of these church modes as well. So here he manages to use this modes and the colors and the sonorities in this particular piece to create a very, very sort of ancient kind of sound. I know when I'm thinking about this music, and I even said this to the orchestra, I think, when I hear this music, I feel like I'm sort of at the twilight in some sort of dark, ancient forest, where there's a ground fog, along the ground, and somehow I've been transported back in time some 5,000 years. So it's ancient, it's mysterious, it's intriguing, and very beautiful as well. This movement is fantastic. Even in these places, one of the basic sort of sonic things that happens in this particular movement is that all of the string orchestras are playing, and they're all playing divisi, which means that even the first violins are playing a couple of parts, violas are playing different parts, cellos are playing different parts, and yet it's really, really soft. So even though it's extremely thick in its texture, it's really soft and gentle. It's mysterious, is what it is. It's really a brilliant movement. I hope that you have a chance to especially pay attention to the second movement of the Moorside Suite. Now, the third movement is called a march. And all good British composers have to write good marches. It seems like it's some kind of national requirement to be a British composer, because they really all did it. Of course, the most famous of them are the Sir Edward Elgar's Pomp and Circumstance marches, the trio of the first march, of which we all graduate to. But it's not just there, of course. It's been used in lots of other things, and you know that music. And then the march itself is a big sort of a requirement, it seems. And this is just like that as well. It's a very typical British march. It's just very, very stately and almost grandiose in a couple of places. Just a beautiful. Even if I had never heard this piece before, I would be sure I would peg it as an English composer, just because it just sounds so British. It does. It really does. So the Moorside Suite by Gustav Holst. Really great piece, probably 12 to 14 minutes long with all of the movements together. So the next piece that we're going to do takes us way, way back, not 5,000 years, but back to the Baroque era. Everybody sort of tends to think that the Baroque era ended when Johann Sebastian Bach died in 1750. And that's, you know, it's kind of a hard line to say, okay, this era ends and the next era begins. But this is a good time, I guess, to choose for the end of the Baroque era because Bach himself was such an incredibly important composer to that era. And arguably, even more important than the composer whose music we will be performing. However, I think that most people would agree if Bach is the most important composer of the late Baroque period, then this man is clearly the second most important, and that is George Frideric Handel. Handel is a German composer, born, raised, and trained in Germany, but then his boss in Germany became King George in England, so he went off to London and spent the rest of his career, in fact wrote pretty much most of his really important works while he was in England. And because of that, really, he became famous for his choral orchestral pieces because he wrote them in the English language, what at the time no other great composer was doing. Of course, we all know the Messiah, which is this really great big oratorio for soloists, chorus, and orchestra that contains the very famous Hallelujah chorus that, you know, even if you're not sure what I'm talking about, I know that you've heard it before. I think I just heard some kind of little snippet of it on a mustard commercial recently or something like that. I mean, it's an iconic kind of piece of music that seems to just never go away. Well, we're not doing anything quite like that, but we're doing a really great piece called the Concerto Grosso. Concerto Grosso. This happens to be one of his early ones. It's Opus 5, I beg your pardon, it's Opus 3 and an F major. And it does have a couple oboe players, a couple bassoon players, but that's it. And it also has a harpsichord player, which we will have. We'll have a real live harpsichord at the concerts. That's also kind of exciting. Not the kind of instrument that you generally get to have around the orchestra. Great harpsichord, great player. It's going to be fun. So, ladies and gentlemen, what is a Concerto Grosso? I got to tell you that it's kind of hard to define because it was one of those Baroque terms that was kind of thrown around a lot, kind of loosely, and different composers kind of did different things and called them Concerto Grosso. But one thing is for sure, that it is the seed of what became the modern concerto in the next century. You know, when you go to an orchestra concert and the violinist comes out and Itzhak Perlman plays the Tchaikovsky concerto and everybody claps because it is fabulous. That is the concerto. Baroque Concerto Grosso was kind of the beginning of that because even though in a lot of Concerto Grossos like this one, there aren't really specifically soloists, there are nonetheless passages in each one of the parts where there's a solo section, like the first violinist will play something, or maybe one of the others, the violist or the cellist, will play a little bit of a solo section within the context of the piece. So as that solo part began to be more and more developed, then the modern concerto did in fact grow out of the Baroque Concerto Grosso. So this is a great little piece, a kind of piece that we wouldn't be able to really program if we had the full orchestra, because it's really quite small in terms of the number of people that are required to play this piece. So it's really a great opportunity for us to do something completely new. And for us, this kind of a piece is really completely new. It's also a 4-movement piece. It's not you know, it's more like a contrapuntal kind of piece than it is a traditional sort of homophonic kind of piece, but it's really a lot of fun to play and got some really pretty difficult fast passages in it. The movements themselves are, you know, the first movement is a slow introduction and then an allegro. This is followed by a slower kind of song form kind of music piece, rather very beautiful, by the way. Then a sort of fast, sort of a contrapuntal, sort of fugue kind of movement. And then the last movement, interestingly, is a minuet, which is a formal dance. And again, kind of unusual to end a piece of music on that kind of dance. But again, like I said, a Concerto Grosso is not sort of stuck into the kind of movements and the kind of forms of each movement that the later concerto would be. So We get to play a Handel Concerto Grosso. This is, like I said, again, it's Opus 3 in F major, and it does have some solo sections within the music, but it's not a concerto like you would think in the modern sense of the word. Great little piece. I'm really happy that we're going to be able to do it for you. Again, this piece is, I think, all told about 12 to 14 minutes long. Now, our final piece is a piece that I'm really, really excited about. Not just because it's Mozart, although that's enough, reason to be excited. It's a Mozart symphony. It's the Symphony number 36 in C major, and it's sort of subtitled The Linz. Linz, as you may know, is a city in Austria. During the 19th century, it sort of became the Austrian industrial city, it tended to be where a lot of the factories ended up and a lot of manufacturing and that sort of thing. But it was not so during Mozart's time. It was just a kind of a provincial town. Traveling was really, really difficult in Mozart's time, and he did a lot of it, especially since he had such a short life. But traveling, it's not like today when you would, even if you were traveling by car, you drive all day, then you go check into a motel, you get up the next day and just keep going. Traveling was so arduous that if you did an entire day of traveling, you probably needed a little bit of a rest. So it was typical for travelers to go to a city like Linz on their way to someplace else and stay. And now Mozart had a specific reason for wanting to stay, because he could do a concert or two, write some music perhaps, make a little extra money, help finance his trip. So Mozart's stop in Linz was when he was actually on his way back to Vienna. And lo and behold, he discovered when he got there that he didn't pack a symphony with him. And yet he had an opportunity with the orchestra in the town to perform a symphonic type of work. So, in fact, he wrote this symphony really in a couple of days. I think it was like 4 days, perhaps, and then had maybe one rehearsal for it, and then the symphony was actually premiered in the city of Linz. That's why it's called the Linz Symphony. And really, Mozart, I think some people kind of have the wrong idea about Mozart and how he was composing. People tend to kind of think sometimes, especially later in his career, that there's maybe some evidence, or a lack of evidence actually, that maybe his last 3 symphonies, including the great C major Jupiter Symphony and the G minor Symphony numbers 40s and 41s, there's no real record of those pieces being performed during his lifetime. So this has given rise to this kind of myth about Mozart writing these pieces, for the future, in perpetuity, because they are really very difficult. And any orchestra at the time would have had a lot of problems performing those pieces on one rehearsal. Sometimes these pieces were even sight read at concerts at the time. So Mozart must have been writing his later symphonies for some kind of future generation or future audience. It's just not true. Mozart wrote music to be played in his time. Mozart wrote music because it was his job and his living. And Mozart wrote music with an eye every time during the course of his life for it to be performed and to be liked and appreciated by the audience. This was really, really big, very important to him. So he wasn't writing because he thought that some future generation might come to understand him as we know, some romantic composers did. No, Mozart wanted his music performed, and he was very practical about it. He was a practical composer. Having said that, of course, there's no doubt about his genius and his brilliance, and this piece definitely reflects that. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the piece itself in a moment, but I want to tell you for a moment something about the history of this piece as it relates to the Beaverton Symphony Orchestra. Beaverton Symphony Orchestra has been around about 35 years now, and my predecessor, the founder and director of this orchestra for 25 years, was very much into this kind of music. I mean, he did a lot of Mozart, Haydn symphonies, Beethoven symphonies. This is great music, of course, fantastic music, but he really sort of concentrated on this kind of music when he was the music director of the orchestra. And yet, I have discovered recently that the orchestra has never performed this symphony, which for me is really exciting. It really is very exciting because I myself, I know this piece. I'll just show you, I've been turning to it. It's just a kind of cardboard score of the piece, but this is the score of the piece. This piece is really very near and dear to me. I like this symphony a lot. There's lots of great things in it to like. So I get this opportunity. I get this, one of these fairly rare opportunities as a conductor to bring something to the orchestra that I really love and feel passionate about, and to be able to show it to them, to be able to perhaps even sell it to them. And I gotta tell you, folks, you know, I've been conducting for decades now, and there's a lot of great things about what I do, but one of the greatest things is for me to be able to take something that I feel strongly about, a piece of music that I love, work with it with a group of musicians who don't know the piece, and then have them develop a real appreciation for that piece as well. That's one of the greatest compliments I can ever receive as a conductor, is for one of the orchestra musicians who know the repertoire to come up to me and say, you know, Travis, I didn't know that piece before. I really, really like it. And it's great, because what that means is that I have somehow had an opportunity to enrich their musical lives, to make it just that little bit more deeper and a little bit more that meaningful. And let me tell you something. As a conductor for 25 years now, that is one of the most satisfying things about what I do as a conductor, just to be able to enrich somebody's lives, especially a fellow musician, with a piece of music that I happen to know that they don't. The Linz Symphony, number 36 by Mozart. It's a 4-movement symphony, as almost all of the symphonies were, as established by Papa Haydn, Joseph Haydn, the father of the symphony. And so the first movement, it's just in your normal form. The second movement in a slow form, a song form. The third movement is a minuet. Typically later on they became scherzos, but this is still a minuet kind of movement. And the fourth movement is in a form that's called a rondo. It's quick, it's light, it's happy, and it's a really, really great piece. This piece, I said, it was in C major, and that key itself had certain meanings for Mozart. It's a key of happiness, a key of sunniness, a key of optimism. And that pervades this piece really, really from beginning to end. So the Mozart number 36, the Linz Symphony, if you haven't heard it before, then I'm even happier than I was for, just not having the musicians know it before, because I think it's a great symphony, and I hope to be able to convince you of that as well as you hear our performance of this piece. And as strange as it may seem, this piece is going to be the premiere performance for the Beaverton Symphony Orchestra. How about that? Okay, before I let you go, I'm going to tell you one more thing here. You may know that I tend to, if you've come to the pre-concert talks before in the past, you know that I'm a bit of a book person when it comes to things. I tend to find that reading really does strengthen and help my own particular study of a piece of music. It helps me, get more into the composer and to maybe perhaps understand a little bit more about how a piece of music needs to be or should be interpreted. I sometimes even get good musical ideas out of reading a really good biography of a composer. And now I have to show you this book that I just finished recently, and this is the newest biography about Mozart. It was only published, I think, in December of last year, and this is Jan Schwafford's book called Mozart, The Reign of Love, and it most certainly is available. You can tell it's a hefty book. I had to buy it in hardback because I don't think it has yet come out in paperback. I'm sure it eventually will. But this has been a great book for me just because, like I said, reading this book has allowed me to find new things out about Mozart, to give me a new perspective, a different angle about the man himself. I feel like I'm closer to Mozart now than I have ever been before. But I have to tell you that even though Jan Schwaffer did an excellent job, this is now, I think, the new best biography on Mozart. And as you can imagine, there's been a lot of writing about Mozart over the years. He's one of those iconic figures, you know. Leonardo da Vinci, Beethoven, Michelangelo, Napoleon, and Mozart. You know, those kinds of names are so famous in our world. But I'm going to reach back here right now, and I'm going to grab from my biography bookshelf a book that I also want you to know something about. This is this is also a biography about Mozart, and it's written by Maynard Solomon. Maynard Solomon. And I think it was published back in the 1990s. It's called Mozart, A Life. And I got to tell you that when this book was written, it was the best biography of Mozart, you know, really until this past December when Jan Schwaffer published his book. But this book it's also a substantial book, as you can see. It is in paperback, this one. But it's a book that I love because I read it at a really kind of important time in my life where I was really, you know, of course I'd always known who Mozart was, but this book really, really gave me some insights at a time when I really needed it. So I got to say, I love this book. I love this book, even though I recognize that the next one, the Jan Schwaffer biography, is probably, you know, maybe one step above. But the great thing is that there are two fabulous biographies of Mozart out on the market now, and that's a great thing. So if you are a Mozart aficionado, I suggest you get both in your library, as I do. Right? Both books are big; they're substantial, you know, and of course they go through some fairly long-haired, you know, analysis of some of the pieces of music. But you could just skip through that stuff, and you'll still get a lot out of the books. I really do want to recommend both books to you. Well, folks, this is going to wrap up our pre-concert talk for this next concert, and I got to tell you for sure that I'm really excited. I've been having to kind of try to connect with a camera all this year when I talk to you. I'm really, really, really looking forward to connecting with you directly, face to face. How about that? When our new season starts in the fall of this year, we're planning on having you back in the hall with us and all of our orchestral musicians on stage. Who knows what kind of thing we might still have to do, but that's the plan right now. And that also means that at a pre-concert talk, I get to see you in person. And I cannot wait, really, for you to be in front of me and in front of the Beaverton Symphony Orchestra as we continue and move on in our growth together. Thanks very much for your time.